There we go. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the final installment of the Duluth Interfaith Dialogue for this year on a very interesting topic of the role of religion in social justice. Because of the time change, our session starts while our Jewish community is still observing their Sabbath. But we wanted a representative to join us from the Jewish community to participate. So we asked one of the panelists, our attorney, Fred Friedman, to tape his talk so that we can all hear what he has to say as part of the dialogue. So he will be the first speaker in the panel today. So before we start, I thought what I do is maybe just read out briefly the blurb that was sent out as an introduction to the session. It'll be good to kind of set the stage here. So when we think about social justice and religion, we don't necessarily place, social justice and religion in the same basket. And social justice is often perceived to be at odds with religion in general. The opposite sometimes is, authoritarianism and repression is sometimes associated with, what is normally known as religion. So, but the question here is, does this common narrative deserve its current reputation? And there have been cases in the past that reflect the sense that religious values have no place in determining public policy, for example, or legal judgments. There's a case recently that judges have been asked to recuse themselves if found that they had or they hold fervently to their religious beliefs. So there's this tussle or, I guess, tension between social justice and religion in general. And of course, recently the controversy concerning the leak of the draft of the Supreme Court bears witness to this difficult relationship, between social justice and rights and religion and so on. So we're right in the middle of that whole controversy that we're witnessing right now. So hopefully this panel that we're holding will be timely, and we can address some of the issues that are in our hearts today. So with that, let me start the recording of the attorney. I'm going to share my screen and listen to attorney Fred Friedman. He brings with him a long, distinguished list of Let me just start it again, sorry. All right. There we go. We have with us Fred Friedman, who is an attorney and public defender since the 1970s, an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota. He brings with him a long, distinguished list of accomplishments, including serving as Chief Public Defender of Minnesota's 6th District, Chair of the National Association of Public Defenders Strike Force Committee, and recipient of the Jack L. Littman Social Justice Award, which is the reason why I invited him to speak to us today. He's also the Minnesota Public Attorney, also won the Minnesota Public Attorney of the Year Award, Minnesota Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers Lifetime Achievement Award, the Jack Durfee Distinguished Service Career Public Defender Award, among others. Fred currently, or in the past, has served on the boards of the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial, the Boys and Girls Club Scholarship Committee, and the UMD Baumler Kaplan Committee, the Duluth Lifehouse, Woodland Hills, the Duluth Police Foundation, and the Northeastern Minnesota Legal Aid. And I'm so happy that he could join us. So the floor is yours, Fred.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's always an honor to be asked by you to do anything. So we're going to talk about Judaism and social justice. So Judaism has had an all-enveloping and passionate dedication to the idea of justice. The moral imperative of justice, of ethics, and morality were taught by the Torah and the Jewish prophets, so that there are religious ideas of obligations rather than just good behavior. We are obligated to care for the poor in Deuteronomy, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in Exodus, the Levites in Deuteronomy, and the landless. We're also warned against corruption, bribery, misuse of power, and mistreatment of workers. The Torah specifically specifies rights for women and for other groups. The Torah teaches the idea of justice for the benefit of society and the moral guidance of the individual. So in other words, if not for myself, who will it be for? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, where? Now, of course, early days of Judaism started when Jews moved from Mesopotamia to Egypt and then escaped the slavery of Egypt and went to Israel. So there's always been a strong imperative against the concept of slavery, which needs to be emphasized. Why Jews say you celebrate the Exodus in every generation and attack or criticize and oppose slavery in all generations. And this applies not only to Jews being held in slavery, but to anybody, any faith, any color, any gender, any everything. And this involves whether the Jews are in Israel, in the United States, or anywhere around the world, the idea that people are supposed to look out for each other. Now, it's a key concept in Hebrew word is the word of tzedakah. Tzedakah means responsibility to pursue justice. In other words, to quote from Deuteronomy, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. In the Old Testament or in Torah, there are 191 God requires people to do justice. And this is the central declaration of the Torah, echoed over and over again. For example, in Genesis, it says, you shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the high and the low alike. You should decide justly between the Israelite and the stranger. You shall take no bribe, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the justice. Justice and justice shall you always pursue. And that's what God says in Exodus. Genesis says, for I have chosen God that he may come with his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord and to do righteousness and justice to all. So this isn't a concept where Jews owe justice to each other. Jews owe justice to everybody. Exodus says, do not mistreat or oppose a foreigner. Remember that you were a foreigner in Egypt, which is why you hear over and over again why Jews oppose anti-immigration concepts or building walls or don't let so-and-so come. Because I'm not quoting something that I said or something somebody said in the book, but that's God talking, right? Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner. Remember that you were foreigners in Egypt. And folks, friends, we're all foreigners sometimes. Our people somewhere, sometime, we're all foreigners. Exodus also says, you shall not pervert justice due to being poor or somebody that's poor on the opposite side. You shall never do justice, according to Leviticus, never do injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the rich, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. So this is a concept that's been emphasized over and over again, no matter where Jews lived, whether they lived in safety, whether they lived in danger, whether they were welcome in a foreign land, or whether they were chased out in foreign land. It's just always been the concept that it is. Now, it says, Proverbs says to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than any sacrifice, all right? Let not the wise man boast in the wisdom, but let not the mighty man boast in his might, but nor let the rich man boast in his riches, but let him boast that he doesn't understand justice. Proverbs teaches us, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And frankly, that's what I decided to do, what I did for a living with my life. I didn't spend my life representing corporations or doing bankruptcy or suing in auto wrecks. I decided to spend my life trying to advocate for the poor. It was obvious to me from being a young man that the poor had way too many disadvantages in the courtroom, in the street, in the school, in housing, whatever. And I think my job is, as I said in my life, the purpose of my life is reduce the advantages that the wealthy have over the poor. I don't want the wealthy to be a disadvantage, but I don't want them to be at an advantage either. All right? God says, do justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressor he who has been robbed, and do no wrong or violence to the resident, to the alien, to the fatherless, or to the widow, nor shall innocent blood be spilled in their place. If you see a province, the oppression of the poor, and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at this matter, for the higher official is watched by higher, and there is yet somebody over him. Psalm says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. And Zechariah says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, render true justice, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the father, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor. So in Judaism, the concept is taught, and certainly in Reform Judaism, which I am, it's your responsibility to do justice to everybody, not to just each other or people you know or people of means, but to everybody. And this, of course, is the challenge everywhere in the world, including the United States, where we started out. And when the founding fathers founded our country, the idea was to do justice to men who are white and own property. We've done our best to keep expanding that and expanding that and expanding that and attempting to do justice for everybody. Now, we've come a long way, but we got a long way to go. Now, just the fact that Judaism believes in this does not mean that other faiths do not. It does mean that we should all emphasize the importance, the concept of doing justice, because if we're not doing justice, what's the purpose? What's the concept? What's the idea of any of beliefs in a higher being or in faith, or whether you're looking at the Quran, the Old Testament, the New Testament, you pick your readings. It's all about emphasizing justice. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. So that's how I was taught. That's the concept as I see the purpose of Judaism, which means doing justice to each other and each other. That's the way it is. And Nick, those are my comments. That's what I have.
Thank you so much, Fred. I was meaning not to ask questions here, but I realized after your excellent talk that I can't help but ask you some questions. So, you mentioned some very profound quotations from the Old Testament. And as you said, we've come a long way and we have a long way to go. Now, lately, at least from my perception, and this is just me maybe, I'm beginning to see some changes in the trajectory of justice. I'm seeing that, if we could say since the founding fathers that we've improved, I feel like there's some deviation from that original track. What's your impression of?
Yeah, I definitely agree. We have good days and bad days and some deviation, and it's like we take a step forward and a step back. So I totally agree. It's there's so much emphasis on getting ahead or doing this or being better off than somebody or whatever. And I understand the importance of competition and being successful, but that does not mean that you have to leave other people behind. So in other words, if your children happen to go to a good school, I want you to support good schools for everybody. If you're fortunate enough to live in quality housing, you want to support quality housing for everybody. If you're fortunate enough to have access to a strong physician and strong medical care, we need to do that for everybody. And we happen to live in the only democracy on earth that does not provide medical care for everybody, the only one. So, and that's not just the Quran says that or the Old Testament. I mean, Matthew, as New Testament as you get, talks about take care of the sick and visit people in prison and advocate for the poor. So it's not one faith says it. All three of the Abrahamic faiths support that. All three. So sometimes you just got to say, hey, we got to do better than this. And I know it's a major effort all the time. And I'm afraid too many people are interested in scripture for a few minutes during the Sabbath, do you understand?
Yeah.
Rather than every minute of every hour of every day.
Right, exactly. So one of the things I've noticed that's happening is that, as you mentioned just now, the tendency is to use scripture to justify whatever they're doing. And there's one other observation I've made is that there seemed to be an impression or perception that a group have been unjustly treated, and that's why there's this anger, justified or not, arising out of specific groups, and they're saying, and then they'll do things like, well, we need to take care of ourselves. We have to, America first kind of thing. And where does that fall in the teachings of justice that you mentioned now?
Right. So the fact that somebody's was treated poorly or a group was treated poorly, that's not because of you, but we can all do something about it, right? Nobody was treated poorly because you did something or I did something or your folks did or my folks. But that doesn't mean we do not have a responsibility to make things better. We do. I've also found out your comment about quoting scripture, whether it's Quran or either Testament or Bible, people tend to use it for its own purposes and to misstate it, for example, right? I mean, somebody might quote something about heterosexuality versus homosexuality. So sometimes they take that, sometimes they misstate it. Some people quote that's only certain people, or if you don't believe in my specific faith or my specific reading, you're not going to go to heaven or whatever. And a lot of this is definitely misstatement. And some of the stuff we need to take seriously, but not all. For example, it talks in Old Testament about if you're wearing two different fabrics at the same time, you're eligible for the death penalty. Really? Really? You know anybody that believes that of any faith, right? Or how about the concept that women are to be punished greater if they commit adultery than men do?
No.
Well, some of this is absurd. And some of this is because of the too many different translations over too many millennia. I think you know what I mean, right? And of course, one of the things that I think is interesting for clergy to try to figure out, what did God say and what did some interpreters say? It's translated it from Assyrian to Arabic, to Greek, to Hebrew, to Latin, to German, to English. You know what I'm trying to say here?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Those over millennia, something's bound to be embellished. Something's bound to be mistakenly interpreted, for sure.
They argue to this day whether the Greek word for what meant sword or government. To this day, they've been arguing that since the King James Bible in the in the early 1600s. So it's not obvious. Sometimes we just got to make God make the call.
Right. So what I'm getting from what you mentioned there is there seem to be some universal sense of justice that will not be corrupted or smeared by misinterpretation and misquotation and whatever. So that sense, that universal sense of justice is that what is that what you've perhaps
that's what I believe
guided your life with?
Exactly. You treat the poor the same as you treat the wealthy. You treat the homeless same as the people that live in the palace. Right. You try to treat everybody the same. That certain rights everybody has: quality education, quality medical care, for example. Right. The right to go to school where you want. where you could have, and all that. There's certain things you just gotta look out for each other, is what I'm saying. Just kind of look out. I want you.
All right. So I went over a little bit of the time. There was a lot that actually Fred spoke for about 12 minutes. And there was this question and answer going on, which I thought it'd be a good idea to share, since obviously he can't be here to answer any of the questions. But I thought it'd be good to now take a pause and maybe open up for a few minutes while I organize my screen here to get the and you may or may not agree with what Fred had to say, but I hope to hear perhaps opinions or comments or questions that we can pose to our panel that we have here today, or to anyone who's willing to perhaps respond to those questions. So I'd like to open for a few minutes if anybody has any questions, and then we'll go on to our next speaker, which is Reverend Jim Mitulski. Does anybody have any questions? I see Pat raising his hand. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out who's who here. Go ahead, Pat. You're muted.
I belong to the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We're known as the whitest denomination in the United States, about 97% white. However, I resonate to Fred's talking about justice, and you're saying it's a universal. We have formed a group over the last couple of years. I was a newcomer last summer, called the Mica Group, based on Micah 6:8. And our whole goal is to help ourselves learn and help others to learn, what does justice look like? What can we do? We're not to the point where we're acting enough yet, but what can we do to learn more about what that needs to be? What is equality? What is inclusion? What is equity? What are the opportunities that people have lost that we can recompense for or do reparations? So I would be, a sister to Fred, in that regard. And what I have found in my own church over the years is that one of the reasons maybe that justice doesn't get promoted is clergy have been afraid to really talk about it, because it's not popular to ask people to treat people equally when they have prejudices. And, that's another whole issue, but it's only very recently that I have heard from the pulpit what I would call a sermon about justice and social justice and what that means. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, for your comments. Does anybody else have any comments before we go on to our next speaker? All right. Seeing none, let me go ahead and introduce Pastor Jim Mitulski to everyone. So Reverend Jim Mitulski believes the purpose of religion is social transformation and liberation. Jim is interim pastor of Peace United Church of Christ in Duluth. He teaches at United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities and serves on a Minnesota Council for HIV/AIDS Care and Prevention. He is ordained in the United Church of Christ, the Metropolitan Community Churches, and the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. For the first 25 years of his ministry, he served predominantly LGBT and HIV/AIDS affected congregations in New York, California, Texas, and Colorado. He belongs to the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, and the ACLU. He is graduate of Columbia University, Pacific School of Religion, Starr King School of the Ministry, and the Harvard Divinity School. He lives with his cat, Keats. That's the last comment there. So Jim, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick, Nick, for arranging this. I'm sure you'll see an appearance by my cat, Keats, by the way, in this, because he loves Zoom. So he'll be here. And I want to appreciate Nick and the Islamic Center of the Twin Ports for hosting these series, because just the fact of having these interfaith dialogues is in itself a social justice activity. And, we're lucky to have it here, but I've worked in some cities in some parts of the country we're having even a dialogue place where Catholics and Protestants and Muslim and Jews in one dialogue would be considered an outrageous conversation. And people would just find the fact of it really terrible. So I applaud you, Nick, for bringing us together, and everyone who's participating in this tonight, because this is an act of social justice, just our talking and listening with each other. So I know that we have probably lots of different ideas about what social justice is and the role of religion. I tipped my hat in the opening in writing the little intro where I said, I do believe the purpose of religion is social transformation, that the world should look different as a result of our being in it as religious people. And by different, I mean better. That you should be able to tell there's a religious presence in a community. And as a result of the presence of that religious community, there should be less homophobia, less sexism, less racism, less classism. That religion, while it can have a dimension, speaking as a Christian, with the world to come or the afterlife, that's the least important concern. Our principal task is to bring about in this life what we often will dream about for the life to come. So in Christianity, we
had it like this before.
We talk about heaven. We talk about what the afterlife is, but I really believe that Christianity, at its best, which is my own home faith, does its best work when it's concerned with what the world looks like now, here and now. So even the principal spiritual teacher in Christianity, Jesus, talks about, I am the resurrection and the life. And I do believe that when we're true to his teaching, to Jesus's teaching, we're as much, if not principally concerned with life before death, not life after death, and the quality of people's lives. And we have a rigorous social analysis that pays attention to race, class, gender, all of those things. So my own journey around this, as I mentioned, began with I grew up in a church, by the way, that does not believe this. And if I were to articulate what theological strand I believe in, I identify with liberation theology, which comes to us principally from Central and Latin America, though it has had expressions in other parts of the world, including our own country since then, and largely, though not solely, Roman Catholic. And that tradition has gone through a period of really repudiating that and calling it Marxist and saying too concerned with this life. But I really believe in liberation theology. And I grew up in the Roman Catholic faith. I say it with respect and appreciation of the spiritual heritage of my ancestors. But I really had to find a different kind of faith in order to live with integrity as an adult. And there are reasons for that. I found as a teenager that I could not find a place in it, even though it had become far more progressive. I'm in my 60s now, and the Catholicism that I grew up in was much more progressive than we see today. And for people of my age and generation, we had a glimpse of a very social justice oriented faith, and then it changed, and many of us felt that we didn't leave the church left us, and we found other ways of being spiritual and being faithful outside of the Catholic structure, again with respect. And I found a home in first the Metropolitan Community Churches, the MCC, and then the United Church of Christ, the UCC. And the reason I had to leave it, or why it left me, I would say, conventional Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, is because I'm gay. That was the simple, if I had to give you in one sentence. I couldn't be in it and be who I am. And then so many of my friends, especially in college and then in seminary, who are women, also had the same experience just for being female. They could not be in it and be true to their calling. And I pray for them daily. I hope that there's change in that institution. But, you have to live the life you have, the one life you have. So I didn't want to spend the rest of my life trying to defend my place in an institution that really was clearly didn't want me. And I think that was true for many of my friends in seminary, and especially my female friends too, who were just like, no, I feel a calling and I want to live it out now. So to make it short, I started going to gay churches in New York City. I went to Columbia, I mentioned, and in Greenwich Village in the 70s and 80s. There were churches for gay people, and there are churches like that all around the country, actually all around the world, called MCC, or Metropolitan Community Churches. And we found that we didn't want to have to justify who we are. And so we decided that as LGBT people, we would start with our experience and then revisit Christianity to see if it had meaning to us. And what did we have to leave, and what did we have to innovate? And we found resonance in liberation theology. And I'll just name a few theologians if you're interested in theology. Feminist theologians like Mary Daly, Rosemary Radford Ruther, who also wrote about the importance of Latin American and Central American liberation theology in a North American context. And Black liberation theologians like James Cone, and some of the central figures, not even just theologians, but figures like Oscar Romero in El Salvador, became influential to us. So in the Bible, where it says in the book of Exodus, God heard the suffering of God's people and responded, that was to us the basis of liberation theology. God wasn't siding with the institutions or people in power. God sided with people who were suffering. And even if it meant challenging institutions, not just government, not just families, but even religious institutions. And we found a vitality in social justice struggles around challenging sexism, racism, homophobia, structures of class and poverty. And it was our faith that fueled our passion for social change. So those are the faith communities that where I have worked most of my life. And to me, if religion isn't engaged in the work of challenging structures of oppression, then it is complicit in furthering them. And silence is a kind of furthering of that oppression. So in the LGBT or gay churches that I worked in, that became especially clear during the AIDS years in the 80s and 90s. I worked at a church in San Francisco, in a neighborhood in San Francisco for 15 years, where in the neighborhood we lost 20,000 people to AIDS. That's a lot of people. And our own congregation lost 500 members to AIDS in one church. And that was against the backdrop of evangelical and Catholic religious leaders who were saying AIDS was God's punishment to us, and we deserved it. So that kind of religion has no credibility with me. And it's been in those kinds of circumstances that I've come to understand that God is not the one sending punishment. God is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ has AIDS. And I really learned that firsthand. I believe it. Even if the Bible doesn't support it necessarily, the human experience does. And I'm proud to be now in the United Church of Christ, where, like today at the rally against the pro-choice rally, it's not an environment where I necessarily wanted to get up and say, there was a rally in downtown Duluth, and I didn't want to get up and say, oh, I'm a Christian minister, because I know that that doesn't sound very liberation oriented, very social justice oriented. That sounds like the voice of the oppressor. But I was proud to say that I belong in a tradition, the United Church of Christ, that is pro-choice, pro-abortion, pro-women's right to choose, and stands with anyone who is pregnant, who's able to make a choice. Yesterday, when the Texas Supreme Court decided that they will uphold the investigations into parents of transgender children for child abuse, these are terrible things that are happening right now in the name of religion. And that's what people who are oppressed right now in our society think of when they hear religion, they cringe. That's true in most LGBT environments. If you say Christian or religion, people cringe. And to me, our task, if we're committed to social justice, is to turn that around. This is no longer, it's not enough to be silent in the face of it. We really are called right now to speak up against white supremacy, against people trying to use the laws to legislate their particular religious beliefs to keep people in oppressive circumstances. That's what social justice, religion, and the intersection with religion means to me. So that's my quick speech.
Thank you, Jim. So we've heard two opinions so far. We've heard from Fred, we've heard from Jim, and obviously, there are, there's the foundation that's laid down. If I can say, in terms of the Old Testament from Fred, in terms of what justice is, and then you've got Jim's opinions on his life experience and so on. So let's open up a few minutes for any questions anybody might have. Anyway, this is obviously a difficult topic, and life is complex and challenging as we are facing today. So this is why we're talking with each other and kind of sharing our thoughts and finding a way, because if God, we know that God is almighty, he is in control, he's got a plan. So there must be a plan, there must be a way to solve our problems from his teachings. That's my personal belief anyway. So let's open up for questions. Anybody have any questions for Jim or for anyone until we go to Bob next? Go ahead, anyone. Feel free to also use the chat if you'd like. If you'd like to send a chat question to me directly, I can repeat that question out without disclosing your identity or your name. We can also do it that way as well. We'll give it another few seconds. And of course, if you have a question, you can always note it down. And there we go. Pick up Pat again. Go ahead, Pat. And don't forget to unmute yourself. Pat, you're still muted.
I just want to say thank you for the presentation. And I don't know how other people feel, but for some time now, having adult grandchildren, I have really felt that the messages I get from them is if they could come to church and if it would really be justice focused, then they would be there. But otherwise, they're not interested in coming. And we see across the board that, a lot of people are dropping out of going to church. I mean, I don't know specifically other numbers, but I think our ELCA in the last 15 years has lost about 1.5 million people. Wow. Some of those were whole church bodies that withdrew because of our decision in the church to ordain gay people, et cetera. And they didn't want to be a part of that. So we lost a few people that way. But I think we're also seeing young people falling away because we're not attracting them to do the work that they are interested in doing. So that's my piece.
Thank you, Pat. Some serious numbers there. So let's go ahead and let's go on to Chaplain Bob. Bob, who's our next panel speaker. Let me introduce Bob for everyone. So Bob Barnes is a lay Catholic whose ministry's career spans 5 decades of service in Catholic and interfaith settings. He graduated from the University of Minnesota and received a Master's of Arts from the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity. Bob has served as a youth minister, director of religious education, director of a retreat and education center, pastor, and for the past 30 years, a board-certified chaplain. He is currently a staff chaplain at St. Mary's Medical Center. He lives in Duluth with his wife, Jane. They have 4 children and 6 grandchildren living in the Twin Cities. And the floor is yours, Bob.
Thank you, Nick. And I want to echo what Jim said about just thanking you for the work that you've done in keeping this thing going and getting it organized. And thank you so much for that. Yeah, so as Nick said, I'm a lay minister in the church, so I'm not a theologian. Really, I've been a practitioner of the art of ministry for a long time with a passion for social justice. My interest has always been to quote one of the opening lines of one of the documents of Vatican II: the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age. So that's been my life focus in all that I've done. I'm also a member of a worldwide religious order, the Franciscans, that was founded with a special mission to serving the poor and also to healing the environment. So I've acted on this in a few ways, just give you some examples of things over the years. Back in the 80s, Jane and I both had the opportunity to work with an incredible group of Catholic religious sisters in the sanctuary movement, with helping people flee from the violence in Central America. I founded an intentional Christian community that went on to create a grassroots organization to try to tackle the issues of homelessness and hunger in the community that we were in at the time. Also was pretty actively involved in trying to stop the run up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That one didn't turn out so well. Anyway, I want to start my presentation, or my part of the presentation, by turning the question around. And I want to first answer the question, what is the role of religion in our social justice in religion? And I'm going to do that from the Catholic social justice perspective. And then I'll come back to that original question a bit later. So from a Catholic Church perspective, they answered that question pretty strongly. I'm going to throw something up here. This is a statement that came out of a worldwide synod of bishops. Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. Now, like Jim said, that churches have some back and forth a bit on that, but that is still the teaching of the church. And I lost my button to unshare. Okay, here. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I don't need to say much more about the Hebrew scriptures. I think Fred did such an incredible job, but that Catholic social teaching is really rooted in the prophets, in their command to live out God's will in the people around them. And it really is that covenant relationship. So Fred heard it very well. And as I go forward, you're going to hear a lot of the threads of what Fred said in what I go on to say. And of course, in the Christian scripture that Jim has mentioned a bit, just to mention a few things, the command to love one another as we love ourselves. The Beatitudes are a foundational piece. And of course, toward the end of Matthew's gospel is a very notable story where it shows Jesus separating out the sheep from the goats based on how they treated the people around them. So those are also foundations. And then there's a third thread to Catholic social teaching, which for a lot of people is controversial, not accepted, and that's natural law. Natural law is a philosophy that says the pattern of good and evil is kind of built in, it's ingrained in who we are as human beings. And it's more or less self-evident even across cultures. That's a strong thread in Catholic social teaching. And like I said, some people really don't like that idea at all. Where it came from, if you know anything about history and the history of the church, Catholic churches had a real mixed history in terms of justice. It was very slow to come around to the position of being against slavery. I'm sure you've heard of the Inquisition somewhere along the line. And up until pretty recently, the church was against religious freedom for reasons that I won't go into right now. On the other hand, there's been a long history of trying to call people to justice, especially rulers, in the treatment of their people. There's been a long history of trying to limit war and the destruction of war. So it's kind of been a mixed bag over the centuries. The modern social justice tradition, though, is much newer than that. It's roughly about 130 years ago that it started. And what was going on in Europe was the Industrial Revolution. And so in the late 19th century, we had unbridled capitalism, the quest for power and profit that was really causing the oppression of workers. At the same time, you had Marx basically accusing the churches of being complicit in that and actually working to uphold that oppressive social order. And of course, you remember his famous phrase about religion being the opiate of the people. So in that environment, the Pope at the time, his name was Leo XIII, he wrestled with that and thought there's got to be an authentic gospel response to what's going on. And so he wrote up a document that the Latin title is Rerum Novarum, if you're interested. The English translation is On Many Things, and really looked at what was going on in Europe and trying to find, and it worked to find a middle course between that capitalism and that Marxism that was going on at the time. That tradition has been added to for the last 130 years. It's just grown and deepened. And it's really a pretty powerful tradition now that is strongly held within the church. It's also called the church's best kept secret because most people don't know about it, including Catholics, which is why I wanted to talk about it a bit. But I'll tell you a story to kind of illustrate that. When we were starting our community meal back in the late 80s, we were engaging all of the different churches in the town to be part of this and to take turns providing meals and the different things that we were doing. And one of the most vocal opponents of what we were doing was one of the Catholic priests in town. And so I called him up to try to figure out what was going on, what was behind his opposition, and hopefully trying to change his mind, which didn't happen at the moment anyway. So he went on talking about how can you be sure these people are really needy, and if you give them help, they're just going to stay doing their bad head behaviors, and he had a whole litany of. And I listened, and finally I got exasperated. I said, "Father, what about the gospel?" It made him stop and think, which is, I guess, all I could hope for at that point. But he did think about it, and several months later, his church did get involved, and it was almost universal support from all the churches in the town for what we were doing. So I'm going to go back to my share here. Answer the question, what is justice in Catholic perspective? And as it states there, justice is a state of social harmony in which the actions of each person best serve the common good. That's a lot of language, but there's three elements that are in that diagram, and I like this diagram because it really shows it so well. Across the bottom, you have what's called commutative justice, which is basically what we owe to each other in our relationships with each other as individuals. We respect the dignity of other people. We act honestly in relationships. And some example of this would be in an employment situation where workers owe their employers a day's work for a day's pay. And employers, on the other hand, are obligated to treat their employees with respect as persons, including fair wages and humane working conditions. So that's the people-to-people piece of justice. Distributive justice is the one we hear talked about the most. And in healthcare, when they mention justice, they're almost always talking about distributive justice. It's how the burdens and benefits of society are shared. So it goes from the society to the interaction with individuals. What does society owe to people? This element of justice requires that the allocation of income, wealth, power in society be evaluated in terms of how it affects everybody, including the poorest people in society. It also means that society has a duty to us as citizens to enable us to be actively engaged in life, in society, in politics, whatever means, but it's what society owes to us as individuals. The other leg of the triangle is what's called contributive justice, and that's just the reverse. That is what we as individuals owe to society at large. What is our duty to contribute to the common good of all? This particular leg stresses that all people have a responsibility to be active, engaged parts of members of our society, that anyone who can should work for justice, should do their part to contribute to the whole community. And in words of one of the popes, it is of the very essence of social justice to demand from each individual all that is necessary for the common good. So some examples of that would be things like getting out and voting, paying your taxes, good stewardship of resources, it's service, whether it's military or non-military service, but it's the ways we give something back to society. One thing that this view of justice really stresses is the difference between justice and fairness. We Americans are really big on fairness. We want everybody to be treated equally. The church, again, looking at that from that biblical idea of justice as being things in right relationship to each other, stresses justice over fairness. For example, an example of fairness in our culture would be the flat tax that was promoted by politicians several years ago. Everybody pays the same thing. Okay, well, okay, fairness sounds good, right? Everybody's treated equally. Justice would imply that the people who make more should contribute more. What we call is our progressive tax system. And the church would actually say it's not progressive enough because we have people that are, as you all know, are not contributing very much back to society. So that's an example of the difference between fairness and justice. Now, over the last 130 years, 7 themes have developed out of this, and I'm going to pull those up here. And I'll just go through them real quickly because I want to leave time for our discussion. But the first theme is the life and dignity of the human being. The church teaches that life is sacred and precious, as I'm sure you've heard all over the place lately. It also says that people are more important than things. The measure of any institution is how well it treats and enhances the dignity of each individual human person. Thus, there's an emphasis on the unborn, which is very famous in our culture. We hear about that a lot, but it also means prisoners, it's the poor, and from again, the Hebrew scripture, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger among us are all part of that. The second one is a call to family, community, and participation. People are precious, but they're also social. And so this recognizes that how we structure society directly affects human dignity. So this also includes healthy marriages and families. This particular theme says that people have both a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together the common good. In practice, we can get back to this in our discussion. In practice, Catholics should be reconcilers and not partisans in terms of societal things. But we'll come back to that, I'm sure. The next one talks about the rights and responsibilities that we all have. Basically, preserving human dignity requires that we balance the rights to be protected and those social responsibilities to be met. All people have duties and responsibilities, as it's shown in that diagram. And unlike the Constitution in this country, the church strongly promotes what are called positive rights. The Bill of Rights talks about what the government cannot do to us. Positive rights talk about what the government should do for us. And I only use government in the sense of how do we as a society collectively organize ourselves? And that's basically what government is for. So a positive right would be everybody has a right to food, shelter, healthcare, employment. That's been a difficult concept in this country, politically anyway. The third one, or the next one, is option for the poor and vulnerable. this is the primary way that that is a moral test of how our society is working. Right now in this country, we have an incredible gap between the rich and the poor, and it's growing. Our Catholic tradition instructs us to put the needs of the poor and the vulnerable first. And the term for that is called the preferential option for the poor. And you heard from Jim's experience that really strongly came out of the South American model of church and solidarity and a few other things that came out of that whole movement in South America. The next one is the right and dignity of workers. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. The economy exists to serve people, not the other way around. Work is more than a way to make a living. It's a way of getting involved in human dignity. It's participation in society. It's participation in God's creation. The basic rights of workers must be respected, including things like the having productive work to do that engages them, a right to decent wages, to the organization and joining of unions. Next one is solidarity. Basically, that is the principle that says we are all in this together, regardless what our national, racial, ethnic, economic, ideological differences are. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers, wherever they are in the world. So it's not even just about Americans. To quote from Martin Luther King Jr., that really, I think, captures the same idea. Quote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly," unquote. And the last one here is care for God's creation. We are called to protect not only people, but also God's creation. We have an incredible environmental challenge going on in the world right now. The church sees it, that it has fundamental moral and ethical dimensions that cannot be ignored. And in fact, in the church as a whole, not the American church, but in the church as a whole, taking care of the environment is really seen as the preeminent pro-life issue. So that's just a quick overview of the Catholic social teaching tradition. It is, I'll stop my share here. It is a set of principles. It's not prescriptions. It doesn't tell us how to do things. It's not pat answers. It gives us a formulation for how do we reason through the really difficult and complex issues of the day. And it really is the beginning of where that process of discernment starts. So that's the tradition. So I want to go back to the original question quickly, because I think it really has some things that we can say, at least I think I can say about it. The first is back to the original question, which what is the role of religion in social justice? I want to start off by saying it's not required. I know many people that I've known over the years who profess no faith, who are involved in social justice work and are working hard to make the world a better place. And that's especially true with young people. That's been noted already. So I think we need to recognize that that movement is very strong outside of the churches. No matter what the environment, though, I think the key is transcendence. To recognize that there's something bigger than me, that's outside of me, that is worth making sacrifices for. It's kind of altruism on steroids. So the churches have a natural advantage in that sense, or religion, I should say, not just churches, because that's a primary focus of almost any religion in the world, is that sense of transcendence. By whatever name is given to that other, whether it's God, Allah, Adonai, higher power, however we name that reality, it is calling us to something beyond ourselves.
A minute, Bob.
Okay, and I'm just about right then. Religious faith also provides staying power. Over the years, I've noticed social justice movements tend to burn out really quickly without some deeper sense of mission. Think about the anti-nukes movement or the Occupy Wall Street movement. Theological reflection pushes us to contemplate the deeper why questions that get us some staying power behind our movements. Next, most religions are transnational, meaning that they have the ability, if they choose, to look beyond any particular nation's pet agenda or their interest. Catholic Church and the Muslim community alone each have over 1 billion members throughout the world. That's an incredible amount of energy. And finally, religions have the capacity to organize people and resources at scales that no NGO can possibly match. We have, you can think of the civil rights movement that happened early in my lifetime, was deeply rooted in religious communities, especially the Black churches. Today, we have things like global outreach. We have Faith in Action, the Unitarian Universalist Association, Lutheran World Relief. There's a number of things that are working at these issues at a worldwide level. So just a quick summary, I think religion has been a positive force in social justice, but we have a long ways yet to go to really fully realize our potential. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. So there's so much to process there from all our three speakers. And I'd like to just go ahead and open up for questions and discussions from everyone. Again, it's you know, it's as I said, it's a tough topic, but this is what God has challenged us with. This is the you know, what we are supposed to be working with in this world. So go ahead. Anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments? And again, the chat is open for anyone. If you'd like to just directly message me, I can repeat the question to everybody else to hear. Does anybody have any questions? We do have kind of a backup plan in case there are no questions. And I'm not sure if Charlotte is with us. Charlotte, are you there? Let me just check. So yes, Charlotte's there. So my understanding is that Charlotte could step in as a discussant or maybe provide some comments from what she's heard from our speakers or panelists. So Charlotte, are you with us? There you go.
With you. I've been listening, but I wasn't expecting to get called upon. I'm here. First of all, I really appreciated Fred's initial presentation because it's like, professionally, I'm a church person. I mean, that's what I've done for 40 years of my life. But it's people like Fred that are like practicing social justice in society that gives me hope. And so, Fred, just thank you. Thank you for your career. Thank you for putting into practice in our society, not just in our churches, the mandates of the prophets. So I guess that's one of the comments that I would want to make. And I would want to say that folks can do that in a variety of occupations. I think we tend to think of social services as being places where people can practice their faith. My dad was a scientist, and he was a nuclear physicist. And one of my treasured possessions is a letter that he wrote to me when I was in first grade, because our teacher had asked us to have a parent who is working explain to us what their job was. And most of the letters, I think, from my classmates just sort of outlined what their parents did at work. And in those days, it was mostly fathers. But my dad said, I'm a scientist, and I believe that God gave us a world in which we have many things to learn. And my job is to learn about something called X-rays, which we can't see, but it's part of God's creation. And part of my job is trying to figure out how we can use those now that we know about them in order to make people's lives better. I think that as a first grader, I was learning something about social justice from my dad. And I believe that I was learning it because he was practicing in his everyday occupation some basic faith principles. And I really think that's kind of at the heart of what social justice is about. The church can make a lot of proclamations, and the church can show up on the front lines like Pastor Jim was down at the protest today, or the rally today. I was at the deck with the folks that were doing some anti-racism training today. We in the church can do those kinds of things, but it's the folks that are out there kind of living it in the places where they work and live. Those are the folks that are doing social justice. And I guess that's the statement that I would want to make in response to what I've heard tonight.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Does anyone else have any comments or questions you'd like to share with us? I share Charlotte's feelings about how well Fred started off the session, sharing with us the teachings that comes directly from the Old Testament. I guess one question I had is that, after knowing that this is what God has mentioned about justice, all the great things that we're supposed to do as human beings in the role of being just, and the role that the carrier of this message, which is of course our faith communities, our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, and so on, have in carrying this message. I guess my question to the panelists or to anyone in the group here is, where did those messages get lost? Where did it go wrong, in other words? How did it come to be, or what point did it come to be where suddenly religion is perceived as being the opposite of justice, as the agent of repression, as the kind of thoughts that are common today? So that would be my question, if anyone would care to respond to. Where did those tenets get lost? How did they get lost, and how did they get lost, and where did it all go wrong? Does anybody have any opinions on that? Go ahead, Pat.
I guess one thought that I have long had is that very often, there are these places called church centers, or the heads of the church, that, the church offices. And there's a lot that goes on there, and in the small body that ends up governing the church, if you will, whatever church body. And there's a real disconnect between that and the people sitting in the pews. They often have no clue. Like, there are many people in the Lutheran Church that really don't know what our social statements say. So we're not teaching at the pulpit. We're not teaching in our education often what our church really stands for, and it is about justice. And yet, to the many people in the pews, they find that offensive. I mean, that's my experience in my Lutheran church. And I've gone to a number of them, over a number of years. So I'd throw that out there and see how other people feel.
Another factor that I look back, even when I was young, when I was a adolescent and young person in college, and you see it in young people today, that the churches move way too slow for them. Kids want to move, they want to make a difference, they want to make a change. I was there, I know it well. And churches are institutions, they don't respond well to it. And the Catholic Church is one of the worst of them. The old saying is, the church thinks in centuries. So if you're in the lifetime of a young person and you want to see action. And one of the classical definitions of a prophet was a young man in a hurry. And I was definitely a young man in a hurry, and I was very impatient. And I hear that with young people today, that the churches just are not speaking to their concerns right now. And then I would affirm a lot of what you said there, Pat, in terms of the church bodies themselves.
And I would say when I went to a liberal seminary 40 years ago, even then we were told that we shouldn't tell lay people the things that we were being taught, that they weren't ready yet to hear some, and they weren't even these necessarily the social teachings either. They were some of the things about the Bible and higher criticism, like that, Moses didn't actually write the first 5 books of the Bible. And that's an extreme example because they did tell us we could tell them that, but more some of the things around, that there were like the Gnostic Gospels and things like that. We were told to definitely take it easy with material like that, that lay people just couldn't handle it. And they learned about it through popular culture, and I will say now, as a seminary teacher now, we are encouraged to tell future clergy, no, tell people they can handle it, trust them. Because I think that what we have found is that we've lost some generations to, and I'm only speaking about churches here, to church going because we didn't keep pace with what they could find out about through regular sources of education. We were behind the times, and it's cost us in credibility.
Right. Yeah. So we have Professor Sakit there who raised his hand. Go ahead, Professor Sakit.
Thank you, Dr. Nika-san. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you to everybody. Now, it's a very timely topic, and I agree whatever is shared here. And based on what Reverend Jim Misulski shared, I think it's important that we discuss these topics. Sometimes it's difficult, but we still, make sure that we involve people from all walks of life. Intergeneration, this kind of dialogue is important because otherwise, what happens, where people want to hear, some sort of like a constructive dialogue or platform where they can share their ideas or thoughts. And if we don't discuss those things or avoid discussing those things, definitely we lose, in fact, interest, especially the young generation, as Reverend Jim Misulski, as you shared. And I can see these are very important issues these days, not only in USA, I would say all over the world. It's a very, it's pertinent issues. And I think an open dialogue, and if we can see, go back, that will help actually, maybe, who knows, create interest, especially among young generation, to check the religious text and try to learn, what the religious text talks about, or when we look at the life of every prophet Moses, Prophet Jesus, Isa, Prophet Muhammad, and what we can learn, how they handle situation when they are encountering social justice, or in fact, who knows, if we dig deep, we can find these days we are also talking about environmental justice. So all those things might come up, and this is all about if we can get this information and put them together, and through this interfaith dialogue, that will be a good start, I think. Just sharing my 2 cents here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sakit. Yes, does anyone else have any questions or comments? So I don't see anyone, and just any hands raised or anything like that. I let me just say a few things from what I've heard. When I was, I think several years ago, I used to participate. The Muslim community actually used to participate in this boat race, this dragon boat race. I know it's still going on, but we haven't been able to participate these days. We're not that strong anymore. Anyway, so we used to. They asked me one time to make a T-shirt for the whole team, and one of the T-shirts that we made was a symbol with a caption at the bottom that says, "We're all in the same boat." So it was kind of suitable or apt for the boat race because, like everybody on Earth, we are all actually on the same boat, literally. So that was one of the things that, and in trying to find solutions for these difficult problems that we have, one interesting observation I like to share with everyone here is, and this, even Muslims don't ever know this, really, most Muslims don't know this, that the fact that, religion is not supposed to be just a set of laws and legal, precepts, and this is what you got to do, this is what this all these do's and don'ts and stuff like that. That's not what religion is supposed to be. In fact, if we look at the Quran, you'll be surprised to know that legal precepts take up only 10% of the Quran. So, 10%. So if the laws only take up 10% of the whole book, what the heck is in the other 90%? So it's supposed to be a book of guidance. So just as an example, let me just share one example of this. So one time, one of the in the early mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he was trying to kind of explain the message and so on, and somebody approached him, and he said, okay, I hear what you're saying, he said, and I like what you're saying, but I have one problem. If you can allow me, I'll agree with you. I'll become Muslim, he says. And so the Prophet asked him, what is it that you want to ask? He said, well, I'm all my life I've always gone to prostitutes, he says. This is how it is. This is me, he said. And so he said, if you can allow me to continue with my practice, he says, of going to prostitutes, I'll be Muslim. I'll follow your teachings. Yes. And of course, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he did not react. He did not slap the guy or also rebuke him, says, go away, whatever. He asked him a question back. He says, okay, he said, what if, he says, the prostitutes that were being visited, right? Well, those people like you go to, and he didn't say people like you, he just said, what if those women were your mothers, was your mother? He asked that question to the person. What if that the women, one of those women was your sister, he said. What if, one of those women was your daughter, he said. And, and that changed that person's complete view of his own practice that was unjust in a sense, right? Unjust to women. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, didn't do it by getting angry, or he did it by guiding that person, showing him a view of the practice that person is doing, which is not good for him and for everybody else. And he was able to open up that person's mind to reality as it should be seen. So anyway, I just want to share with the fact that 90% of the Quran is not legal issues. It's kind of important. That's where the wisdom comes in, from that 90%. And there's so much wisdom to be gotten from the 90% of the book, beyond just do's and don'ts and what's halal and haram and prohibited and permitted. Anyway, so let's open up any more questions anybody has for our. Yes, go ahead, Charlotte.
Yeah, Nick, I appreciate that story. And it reminds me that what I appreciate about liberation theology is that it was begun with sensitivity and concern for the folks themselves. And I think sometimes in talking about social justice in the church, we don't do a good enough job of connecting people's lives with the social justice issue. And one of the pieces of ministry that I did out on the High Line of Montana, which is a very Makiso culture, and domestic violence is a big problem, but nobody talks about it, but it's an issue. And so I had some women in the congregation that I was serving that were in situations of domestic violence. And we found some ways for our congregation to help them move beyond that and build their own self-esteem and find some escape plans. And it was actually one of those women who said, could our church open a house for victims of domestic violence? And this is a culture in which that was like super a radical idea. And we did it. And we did it because it began with the connection between the congregation's ministry to some individuals in need, and then empowering them and building support for them to reach out to other people in the community. And so, and that same congregation who was like scared to death of homosexuals and AIDS developed an AIDS ministry. And I was the only minister in the county that would go visit AIDS patients. And what we had was young men at that time who had left our community, gone to the West Coast, ended up with AIDS, came home to die. And so everybody in town knew Charlotte's the one minister that will go to the hospital and visit those folks. And her congregation is the one place where those families will find support. And then it was like out of that experience that community began to witness to social justice dimensions of the AIDS epidemic. So I'm thinking that a part of the failure on the part of the church might be that we haven't really approached social justice issues from the perspective of the folks within our own congregation for whom justice is needed. And that when we can begin to see that and then build on that and not let it get stuck at a kind of toxic charity kind of level, but kind of keep pushing, that's the kind of leadership that can help a congregation begin to discover ways in which to act on social justice issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Charlotte. Yes, does anybody else have any questions or comments? We have about 7 minutes left of our time. Just not a lot of time to discuss such a challenging issue, but if anybody has any last words, maybe I'll kind of maybe move back to our panelists, at least the ones that are here, minus Fred, but if Bob or Reverend Jim would like to say a few words before we end our session. Who would like to go first? Jim? Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I just want to thank everyone for having an open mind. I am from California, and I've only been here for a year, and I was really, frankly, a little hesitant to talk forthrightly about my work in gay churches. I'm gay, and I haven't always. It's been a kind of a dicey year for me, wondering where I can be open and talk about the kind of work I've done in the past. And I've appreciated having an environment like this where I can just say, frankly, candidly, I'm gay. I've worked with gay churches. I've worked with people with HIV. I have HIV. I appreciate that this is the kind of religious environment where we can have conversations like this, and I don't take it for granted. So thank you.
Go ahead, Bob.
That was well said. I don't know what else I can say to it. I think there's a saying among Franciscans that if we can't make up our minds, we'll talk it to death. So dialogue is really important to us, that we will keep talking and talking and talking until we can bring people together. And these kind of dialogues are critical.
Thank you, Bob. So this is, as I mentioned earlier in the session, this is the last installment of our series, and we'll continue after the summer break. And if any one of you would like to get involved, more involved, at least in terms of the organization. In fact, I think Reverend Bruce had mentioned that one other way of doing this is actually to hold an in-person and have it online as well, kind of session where, you know, we'd meet at different churches as opposed to just Zoom, and we can move from one church and one, you know, synagogue perhaps to another, and then kind of, you know, stream it out. So at least we'll be able to meet in person as well as online. That's one of the things that Reverend Bruce mentioned, that he actually offered Unitarian churches as the first one. So we definitely welcome any help from the people here. So if anyone would like to do that or get more involved, please don't hesitate to contact me. You know, perhaps in August sometime, when we can get going with our program in the future. I'd just like to close with, you know, the things that I think we can all agree, that the Almighty, the Creator, loves all of us, cares for us, wants us to succeed, wants us to be rid of our, you know, mistakes and cleanse ourselves, so that, you know, eventually we'll return back to Him. And that's my thoughts of you know, of Him. And again, thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you so much to all those who've participated in our programs and supported it. And I wish you all the best, and enjoy the rest of the beautiful summer. We're beginning to taste a little bit of it. And we hope that we can enjoy the rest of summer in this same beautiful weather. Again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nick.
Great night.
Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening and wonderful beginning of summer, as Nick pointed out.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.